Well, I'm your host with the most, Pirate Master Deadpool Supreme, alongside my enigmatic co-host, Mr. Adam Warlock. Say hi, Adam. Greetings and felicitations, fellow multiverse travelers. It's this today's episode is going to be off the heezy, dog. Okay, you had it and then you lost it. What happened to the stuff from what you were saying from the last episode? Well, as I always say, practice makes perfect, and don't say that I haven't tried consistency at least once. You got a point there. Anyway, today we'll be diving back into the very vast depths of the multiverse, into the terms of alternate history, where we ponder the question, what if? Because as you can probably read from the episode's description, for every regrettable, there is always a hypothetical. That's the one general rule when it comes to alternate realities. And other than that, after that, anything goes. So anyway, today I've decided to pick my top three best alternate realities. These that I think that would actually have been a crucial stepping stone in humanity, if not society's next societal evolution. But anyway, with all that said, let's get down to business, shall we? Join me as we flip through the vast depths of the multiverse and explore the very inquisitive realities of what could have been and what is still yet to be. Here we go. First one. What if Robert F. Kennedy had become president? His message of unity promised hope to a divided nation, but was it a promise he would be able to keep? Yeah, that's right. For those of you who don't know, Robert Kennedy was known as Bobby Kennedy, an equally idealistic candidate, and the younger one of the many Kennedy families. Of course, they were the very upper epsilon of society, as it were. With a victory in the California primary elections, Robert F. Kennedy became a serious contender for the Democratic presidential nomination. The crush of people listening to his victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles on June 5th of 1968, many of them were young and many of them black. Yes, was a testament to the spark of hope he had ignited and the tremors of change rumbling beneath the political status quo. So as you can tell, Bobby Kennedy truly had a crap ton of potential, and unfortunately was cut short in the main timeline. Supporters in despair, Kennedy was in the White House was now one step closer. Political policies. So it seems that one word that would encapsulate the changes RFK would have made: Vietnam. He was not the only candidate arguing for an end to the war. His progressive right-wing rival for Democratic presidential nomination, Senator Eugene McCarthy, had championed that cause long before RFK was in the race. But Robert Kennedy's determination was in the great race of February of 1968. He publicly promised to halt the meat grinder consuming thousands of young American lives, arguing the best way to save most of our precious stake in Vietnam, the lives of our soldiers, is to stop the enlargement of the war, and that the best way to end the casualties is to end the war. Had he fulfilled that pledge, the war would have ended 6 years sooner, saving countless U.S. and Vietnamese lives. Neither Cambodia nor Laos would have suffered the large-scale carpet bombing sanctioned by Nixon from 1969 onwards. And if RFK remains true to the spirit of his wilderness speeches, the U.S. would have adopted a more hostile approach to countries that oppressed its own citizens. In South America, he denounced the military juntas in Argentina and Brazil, and in an apartheid-era Cape Town. He exonerated South Africa's white students to build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. So now we go to the alternate time. We go to the timelines to see what could have changed, what is, and what could be. Power behind the throne. As an attorney general in his brother's case, RFK was a combination of black backroom enforcer, personal shield, and presidential advisor, directly involved with the Soviets in the negotiations over the Cuban Missile Crisis. Correct. Okay, yeah, that. Anyway, had he been successful he had been one to successfully advise a blockade in Cuba, rather than the more confrontational approach of invasion. But wielding such power was so close to the president came with its danger. By the time his chance for presidency came, there were those who felt aggrieved by the way they'd been treated, and ready to share his ride would not end so smoothly. 1963 to 1968. And following his brother's assassination, RFK's political fortunes turned sour. At odds with President John Lyndon Baines Johnson, Kennedy's original vice president, his influence in the White House evaporated. He entered the Senate to represent New York, and, never afraid to voice his views, the gap between him and the administration grew wider. He repeatedly denied he would run for the candidacy against Johnson, but with the escalation in Vietnam, the influence of his wife and his friends, the rising racial tensions, substantial cover-ups of white racism by the administration, he believed that he shouldn't stand on the sidelines. Between April and June of 1968, the death of hope. The year 1968 would see a double tragedy for civil rights in the U.S. Against a backdrop of running battles in the cities between rioters and police, the civil rights activist of the legendary Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a voice of reason and peaceful protest. He was assassinated on April 4th, a few months in April of 1968. By a twist of fate, Kennedy was addressing a crowd in a poor black neighborhood on the same day, and his speech was served as a eulogy for Dr. King and everything that he stood for. Nearly 2 months later, RFK found himself assassinated, and with them both died the hopes of a generation. Truly a tragic black stain. Suffers a tragedy, dark shadow. Yeah, that's a dark shadow upon U.S. political history. Now we go over to the possibility of what could have been if Robert Kennedy was involved. 1969 through 1973, Bob versus the mob. RFK was no stranger to confrontation when it came to organized crime and the exploitation of workers. Union boss Jimmy Hoffa of the Brotherhood of Teamsters had clashed with him in hearing years before, and the mafia bosses were also his enemies. RFK's passion for integrity and transparency in politics was heartfelt, and there can be little doubt that his commitment to justice would have spilled over into his presidency. RFK's war on corruption would have continued, but this time with added presidential power. So he literally would have taken on organized crime, kind of like Joe Valachi. And for those of you who don't know, Joe Valachi was the one who squealed to the senator about organized crime. 1969. We'll be right back with these important messages. Okay, I don't go until 2 o'clock. Don't leave until 2 o'clock. No. All right. Yeah. And we're back. Okay, anyway, sorry about that, folks. Anyway, no more Vietnam. No more Nam, or Nam, whichever way you pronounce it. The pivotal issue overseas would have been the Vietnam War of the time. His view on America's place in the world was one of a democratic role model. And the war had fractured the nation. By early 1968, there were around 485,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam, and 20,000 had been killed. RFK wanted a peaceful settlement, and the troops were brought home. Under the new President Kennedy, all of this would have been possible. Thousands of lives saved, and America's reputation for civilized common sense would have been firmly established. 1969, Rights for All. No RFK presidency would have been complete without an overhaul of the rights of all citizens, regardless of color of their skins or background. His belief in justice for all was unwavering, but he would need all of his personal grit to battle with an uncompromising system that was afraid of political and social change. Some form of compromise would have been needed, but by setting things in motion, the legacy of an RFK presidency may have been a very different, more integrated, and more inclusive society. So yeah, you can tell why this alternate reality is one of my favorites, because with RFK as president, he would have not only ensured carried on King's legendary legacy. He would have enforced it greatly, and if he was president, all of this would have been 100-fold. And speaking of Dr. King, we move to the next one. Let's start with number second one. What if Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had lived? Would he be fine? Would he have been able to continue the fight and finally turn his infamous dream into a true reality? Well, that, my people, is what we are here to discover. From the early 1960s, the fight against injustice, oppression, and inequalities and discrimination and other non-white American citizens gathered pace, spearheaded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself. Through his passionate, charismatic, and measured public speaking and courageous acts of passive defiance, the U.S. and the world were beginning to listen, undaunted by abuse, and prejudice, and ridicule, and even imprisonment. His influence and determination to right the wrongs of America's tainted history opened the door to those at the very pinnacle of power, only for a life of such promise to be callously cut short. But what if there had been more time? With more years, what might have been achieved to change America and the world for the better? You can see, Dr. King's political influence was indeed growing in the spring of 1968. As he prepared a poor people's campaign to occupy Washington, D.C., King gathered a coalition of Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous, and white Americans to demand a guaranteed income, living wage, and freedom from hunger, poverty, racism, and violence. Dr. King's anti-poverty and anti-racist organizing dovetailed into his anti-war and anti-violence efforts. His credibility with young people, international anti-colonial leaders and organizers, and Black Power activists made him an increasingly formidable figure. On the eve of his assassination, King spoke at a rally in support of 1,100 Black sanitation workers who were on strike for a living wage and safe sanitation, safe working conditions. Labor became another pillar of a coalition King forged with sharecroppers in the Deep South, welfare rights, and anti-poverty activists in places like New York and Chicago. Mexican-American farm workers, some connected to Cesar Chavez's movement, and poor whites from Appalachia. King would not have ever formally entered politics, although people implored him to run for president, or at the very least vice president, on an anti-war ticket back in 1968. His political influence would have continued to grow, and his support would have aided a Democratic nominee like Bobby Kennedy, or at least Humphrey Hubert, or Hubert Humphrey, in the general election. Yes, here we go. Let's see. Race relations would have been different if King had lived to the extent he would. From the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, he'd become a global political mobilizer in the age of neoliberal austerity, ushered in under the Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton eras. King might have been able to become the leader of a multiracial, although primarily black-led, movement for social justice that kept issues of black radical citizenship, not just civil rights and voting rights, but a living wage, food justice, equitable and racially integrated schools and neighborhood, the end of police violence and state-sanctioned brutality, and premature Black death. In many ways, the issues of abolition advocated by the Black Lives Matter movement, ending mass incarceration and replacing systems of punishment with investments in health, wellness, housing, education, transportation, and environmental justice, were all King's causes, and would have become part of the mainstream sooner had he lived. The racial and political reckoning of 2020 might have come sooner, with a figure like King capable of criticizing the nation as he also sought to build consensus around black citizenship as well as dignity. Would he have impacted on the Vietnam War? The King's activism impacted Vietnam to the extent that he illustrated the moral rot at the center of the American project. Contrary to the time and a few, with the exception of Malcolm X, who did so as early as 1964, were courageous enough to do so. King might have been able to impact the Vietnam policy if Hubert Humphrey or Bobby Kennedy had been elected in 1968. King might have provided that president with a middle ground between the the hawkish continuation of the conflict, which did not end until 1975, and including Nixon's morally reprehensible bombing of Cambodia, and the immediate, complete, and peaceful end to the war that Kennedy, the King, had so desperately longed for. Yes. Anyway, his ambitions would have led to King's ambitions were to build a beloved community free of the economical inequality, structural racism, war, and violence. He believed in redistributive justice, which is why he admired Scandinavian countries with their mix of free markets, fair taxes, and broad social safety nets. King would have wanted every American to have guaranteed income, living wage, decent housing, healthcare, education, and equitable transportation. King would have believed in dignity and citizenship for all people, and he would have pushed for federal guarantees that offered resources to state, municipal, tribal, and other communities to ensure that this occurred. Legislatively, he would have certainly pushed for an economical Bill of Rights, and might have been able to persuade the Democratic Party of the 1970s not to jettison the Humphrey Hawkins' full employment bill, a proposal that had been an unfulfilled staple of the party for many years. He most certainly would have advocated for an increased minimum wage, the fair treatment of migrant workers, the desegregation of skilled labor, and a robust and multiracial labor movement, one that included the black folk and brown folk working the meanest and dirtiest jobs for starvation wages, and in agriculture, poultry farms, meat packaging industries, as cooks, dishwashers, cleaners, in slaughterhouses, and sometimes unpaid day laborers. Would his legacy be the same or different today? A longer time on the world stage would have afforded King time to build a. Excuse me for a minute. Yeah, just had to stretch my legs for a little bit. A longer time on this world stage would have afforded King time to build a bigger economic power base for the movement through a member-based organizational model that relied on poor and working people's struggle for citizenship and dignity to self-fund a global movement for racial and economic justice. King would have sought the end of poverty and the rollback of the Great Society, and would have made a significant enough figure to challenge the FBI's COINTELPRO, a counterintelligence program that led to the murder, arrest, and exile of black and new left political activists and organizers. He could have gone toe to toe with Richard Nixon and the lies of his presidency and damaged these lies into the American people's faith in democracy. He would have sparred with Ronald Reagan and the racism behind the welfare queen slur, as Reagan was known for using during his presidency, and the cuts to social spending while increasing funding for the military, police, and jails. Finally, King would have crafted an alternate vision from the nostalgic dreams of the 1950s that looked toward the present and future and the pursuit of multiracial democracy. Let's see, rather than fantasies rooted in the era of racial segregation and Jim Crow violence that he unhappily had to live through. Would Dr. King Day exist? It might not exist as an official holiday. The holiday was produced in the 15 years after King's assassination. Thus, if he had lived, it is safe to say that we live in America too partisan to pass such a holiday. But who knows? Juneteenth as a national holiday seemed light years away until 2020. But even without a holiday, King's legacy would have survived, endured, and thrived in the minds and hearts of millions of people across the planet. Our best example of this is the legacy of Malcolm X, who, in many ways, remains King's legacy rival, adversary, and alter ego. Malcolm X has never received a national holiday, but is celebrated in film, hip hop, history books, pamphlets, sound recordings, and so much more. Without the imprimatur, I cannot pronounce that. Wouldn't want to say my life. Anyway, of a federal holiday or monument in the nation's capital, King would have still resonated within Black America and global culture as a prof, prophetic figure, the American apostle who, like the Old Testament prophet Moses, descended upon on an unholy land with a kind of biblical force and power capable of bringing his people, which he defined as the entire world, to the promised land, before being struck down by an assassin whose bullet might have killed the man, but is unable to destroy his very dream. Now then, we go to the past of what genuinely happened here. 1955 to 1959. No-go Jim Crow. As a result of the Jim Crow laws of the South, of the southern states, the U.S. southern states, which are embedded in black segregationist society, in 1955, Rosa Parks is arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus. King was instrumental in establishing a 13-month boycott of the buses, with victory finally coming through a Supreme Court ruling that segregation on buses was illegal. King was also establishing a reputation in the and presence of the New World stage. In 1957, he visited the newly formed African nation of Ghana. 2 years later, he traveled to India. 1963 to 64. The Dream Takes Shape. On August 28th, 1963, King plays a crucial center role in the March on Washington for jobs of freedom. There are more than 200,000 people in front of the Lincoln Memorial to hear his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Next, he meets with President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. The pressure from such action will lead to the foundation of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, followed by the voting rights 1 year hence. Hence, the year 1965. King is declared Man of the Year by Time magazine in 1964. Later the same year, he is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, stating that every penny of the $54,000 prize money would be dedicated to the struggle for civil rights. 1968, an end and a beginning. On March 29th, 1968, King led a march in support of striking sanitation workers in Memphis. It was while planning another protest for these workers that he was shot dead on April 4th, 1968, on the balcony of Lorraine Motel. News of his death resulted in deaths, riots, and across the city, America. Lyndon B. President Johnson declared a day called for a day of mourning to be observed on April 7th, and other events following on that day were to be postponed. A sad, dark shame upon this entire this legacy. Now we hop over to the possibilities of what could have happened if Dr. King had survived long enough to see through his legacy through. 1969. No chance for Nixon. If King had lived, another Democrat president may have been possible. With King's support for either Kennedy or his fellow Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey, the balance may have tipped in their favor. Richard Nixon may have never come into office. The Vietnam War, which King opposed, may have ended far sooner. With no Nixon and no contest for a second term, Watergate and the threatened impeachment and resignation of a U.S. president would have been permanently erased from these alternate history books. 1970. Early release. King was passionate about taking his message around the world. With apartheid in South Africa and Nelson Mandela's imprisonment, it is almost inevitable that King would have used his influence to pressure the South African government for change. With a prominent world figure taking up the cause for equality, the South African government may have conceded defeat sooner. Mandela could have been released earlier to join King in the campaign, bringing the early release of black and Asian citizens of South Africa from the unjust and inhumane historical shackles of apartheid. The 1980s, uniting the world. As a Nobel Peace Prize winner, King's global reputation was beyond doubt, gaining the respect of many world leaders. But given more years and more time to build upon this, it is just possible that in a position such as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, he would have been in a position of strength and influence to openly challenge the many areas of inequality and injustice around the world. His drive and strength and voice making the difference needed to make the change. And who knows, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., UN Secretary General, did not have been as improbable as one may think. So to answer that question, yes, Dr. King's dream could have definitely become a reality. Now, I think we just have time for just about one more, so we'll be right back while I flip through. So let's see. Oh yes, here we are. The very title of the previous episode. What if John Lennon had survived? The music lives on to inspire new generations as the battle for peace remains as tireless as ever. The murder of John Lennon, one of the famous guitarists from the Beatles, was another example of a life so rich in talent, so passionate for peace, and so full of further promise that was brutally and mercifully short before that promise could be fully realized. Had he lived, there is no doubt that more of the world would have continued to hear his unrelenting cries for peace, been moved by his lyrics, and admired his humanity as he championed those in strife or oppression. So much was left unsaid, and things left undone, but what would a world with John Lennon still in it look like today? Yeah, let's see here. Oh, yes, let's see. Pondered the possibility of John Lennon having survived the terrible events of December 8th, 1980. We must acknowledge a central tenet of his philosophy that every life has meaning and that violence has no place in our society. Having said that, I think that the media frenzy after his death would have been a source of great embarrassment, even disappointment for him. Lennon felt that the Beatles' most vital achievements concerned their music as opposed to their fame and celebrity status. He made it plainly known that he didn't want his passing in any way to resemble the tumult that surrounded Elvis Presley's death circa 1977. The same would have undoubtedly had been true had he survived that tragic night. Lennon made it clear that in his public remarks that our energies are better spent making sacrifices to better the lives of others. He and his wife Yoko Ono had planned to travel to San Francisco on December 14th to participate in a protest march on behalf of a group of Japanese teamsters who were fighting a powerful consortium of food importers and distributors. They had already composed a statement of support for striking workers in California. "We are with you in spirit," the Lennons wrote. "In this beautiful country where democracy is the very foundation of its constitution, it is sad that we still have to fight for equal rights and equal pay for the citizens." A few days before his death, Lennon sat for an interview with Rolling Stone's Jonathan Cott, who questioned him about his interest in inspiring people to find the best version of themselves. Lennon hastily replied, "It's still there," adding that he continues to believe in "give peace a chance, not shoot people for peace. All we need is love. I believe it. It's damn hard, but I absolutely believe it." Let me see. Ah, what existing or new causes might he champion, or would he ever consider formal role, for example, with the United Nations? When music lovers wax philosophical about what might have been had John Lennon survived, our thoughts and concerns very quickly turn to the reigning social challenges of the day. Lennon would no doubt have taken issue with this and action over the ills of Thatcherism and the rise of income inequality during the Reagan era. We need only look to Ono's steadfast work during her widowhood as the champion of peace and humanity to understand the myriad ways in which her husband would have maintained a significant voice for the fight in establishing an everlasting peace. Now we turn to the past, where things had happened in real life. The 1960s, mania, magic, and Maharishi. The Beatles achieved so much, influenced and inspired so many, and gave the world iconic songs that will live forever. And yet it was all so brief. But in that time, Lennon would develop from a pop idol to a serious campaigner. The music also developed. Early rock and roll became experimental projects. There were movies, honors, and spiritual retreats. But such was the inevitability of the journey that was the inevitable happened. Each would go their own way, and for Lennon, that meant staying true to himself, the music he was ready to make, and the campaigns he was ready to fight. 1970s, new directions and dead ends. Lennon and Ono faced their shared drug addiction at an exclusive London clinic before moving to the U.S. In 1971, Lennon started to once again flex his creative muscle with the release of the album Imagine, the title track quickly embedding itself into music history. Separating from Ono for a time in 1973, whilst living and working in Los Angeles, the album Mind Games was released. 1975 saw the couple reunite and the breakup of the Beatles. They also welcomed their son Sean into the world, and Lennon decided to become a house husband. In 1980, he released Starting Over from the album Double Fantasy. It would undoubtedly be his last. December 1980. Mark David Chapman, Lennon's killer, described himself as a Beatles fan. On the day that Lennon and Ono left their Dakota apartment in New York, recording go into the recording studio, Chapman was waiting a copy of Double Fantasy under his arm. Lennon asked if he wanted it signed. Chapman nodded. Later that night, the couple returned, and Chapman was waiting with a 38.38 revolver. He fired back, and Lennon was hit 4 times in the back with hollow point bullets. He said, "I'm shot," before collapsing. Rushed to a hospital. The doctors tried to revive him, but his injuries were catastrophic and was pronounced dead. He was just 40 years old. Okay, now this one is actually significant because at the time, this guy, Mark David Chapman, as it were, also was reported to have been inspired by the book Catcher in the Rye, which was adherently responsible for John Lennon's death. But I read Catcher in the Rye in high school, and I found no correlation between it and John Lennon. The fact that this book, in the end, it was just a terrible book with an unlikable protagonist, and the structure of the book was very less than to be desired. I can see why it was considered banned. It was in those days. Besides being quote unquote risque, it was just a terribly written book altogether. And the fact that it has anything to do with Lennon is nothing short of a joke. A sad, dark, and embittered joke with lots of unnecessary history behind it. Now we hop over to the infinite, to the alternate timeline, the possibility of what could have happened should John Lennon had survived his encountered death. 1980s through the 90s. Passing it on. Lennon would have emerged as one of pop rock's most innovative record producers. It would not have meant the end of his own career, but writing for others, inspiring bands and individuals with his talent and experience, and helping them to craft and polish their work. Would have been him giving something back to the industry he knew all so well. And as technology developed throughout the 80s and beyond, Lennon and Ono's work would have no doubt been buoyed by the MTV generation, creating an iconoclastic and influential music videos as another outlet for their collaborative creative talent. 1980s through the 90s. Yeah. With Lennon still on the scene and his rift with Paul McCartney still healed, the possibility of a Beatles reunion would have been very much real. The anticipation for such a return would have been immense. Beatles play Live Aid in 1985, or even headline Glastonbury in the 1990s, or perhaps their very own special concert in support of those around the world in need. Whenever and wherever it was, it would have been undoubtedly the music sensation of the century that would reaffirm the band and their songs as probably the most iconic of all alternate times. The 1980s onwards, voice of reason and hope. Post 1980, John Lennon would not have been short of issues and events to campaign for or against. Some of them would have been familiar with recurring problems: war in the Middle East, famine in Africa, human rights injustices around the world, and so on. And some, such as climate change, would only just be emerging as challenges that needed to be faced. He may have accepted a more official role in the United Nations, or maybe even chosen to follow his own path. Either way, Lennon would have served as a steadfast and much-needed champion of peace and nonviolence in the wake of events such as 9/11, the ongoing crises in the Middle East, and the embattled Ukraine. So I think it's safe to say that John Lennon would have definitely made an everlasting change, and a much-needed one, in this alternate America that we so now know today. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is only but 3 of the top 3 stories. There are many more that we could dive back into, but I think that these top 3 are pretty much the examples of what could have happened to the world these days if like John Lennon himself said, we could have given peace a chance. And that's about all the time we have for today on today's episode, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in with us, and we hope to join in. I hope we'll see you again next time when we dive back into the multiverse for, you guessed it, even more what ifs, some more enriching than the last. And from all of us here at Chill with the Pool, I'm your host with the most, Pirate Master Deadpool Supreme. And I, of course, am your ennobled Adam Warlock. So thank you for tuning in with us, and we hope to see you again next time. No urban vernacular this time? No one likes repetition. Truer words were never spoken. In that case, until next time, true believers, egg